The howling of coyotes echoed through the darkening sky as Julia Vance clutched her basket of fresh, baked bread tighter to her chest, her heart pounding with every step she took along the winding trail that led home from Westcliff, Colorado. The year was 1878, and she had stayed too long at Mrs. Holloway's, helping the elderly widow with her baking in exchange for a few coins that now weighed down the pocket of her worn cotton dress. Julia quickened her pace as the sun dipped lower behind the towering Rocky Mountains. The golden light that had guided her path was rapidly fading, replaced by long shadows that stretched across the dusty road like grasping fingers. She knew better than to be out alone at this hour. Her father had warned her countless times about the dangers that lurked in these parts: outlaws, wild animals, and the unforgiving wilderness itself. Another howl, closer this time, sent a shiver down her spine. Julia glanced over her shoulder and froze. 3 coyotes stood on the ridge behind her, their lean bodies silhouetted against the crimson sky. Their eyes reflected the dying light like small flames, fixed intently on her. "Dear Lord," she whispered, clutching the bread basket tighter. The warm loaves she'd worked so hard to bake now seemed like a beacon, drawing the hungry predators toward her. She knew running would only trigger their instinct to chase, but standing still seemed equally dangerous as one of the coyotes began slinking down the hillside, followed by its companions. Julia took a tentative step backward, then another. The lead coyote lowered its head and moved forward with more purpose. They were stalking her now, their movements deliberate and coordinated. She was still a mile from her family's homestead, with nothing but open country between her and safety. The crack of a whip split the air like lightning, so sudden and sharp that Julia nearly dropped her basket. The coyotes scattered, yipping in alarm as the sound echoed across the plains. A horse's whinny followed, and the thundering of hooves grew louder as a rider approached from the direction of town. "Get back, you mangy beasts!" A deep voice called out as a tall figure on horseback came into view. The man cracked his whip again, sending it snapping through the air with expert precision. The coyotes retreated further up the hillside, watching warily. The rider pulled his horse to a stop beside Julia. In the fading light, she could see he wore a wide-brimmed hat pulled low over his eyes and a dusty leather vest over a cotton shirt. A weathered face with a strong jaw and keen blue eyes looked down at her with concern. "You all right, miss?" he asked, his voice gentler now. Julia nodded, still clutching her basket. "Yes, thank you. They just appeared out of nowhere. Coyotes get bold when they're hungry." He glanced at the ridge where the animals still lurked. "Name's Ryker Vaughn. I'd be happy to see you home safely if you'd allow it." Julia hesitated. Her father had also warned her about strangers, especially lone men who roamed these parts. But the coyotes were still watching and darkness was falling fast. "I'm Julia Vance. My family's homestead is about a mile east of here." Ryker nodded, extending a hand down to her. "The Vance place." "I know it. Your father raises cattle, doesn't he?" "Yes," Julia replied, surprised. "Do you know him? We've crossed paths. I'm new to these parts, but I make it my business to know my neighbors." He gestured to his hand. "Come on, Miss Vance. Those coyotes won't stay scared off for long." Julia hesitated only a moment more before taking his offered hand. His grip was strong as he lifted her effortlessly onto the horse behind him. She balanced the bread basket in one hand while holding onto his waist with the other, careful to maintain a proper distance despite the necessity of their closeness. As they rode, Julia noticed how Ryker sat tall and alert in the saddle. His horse, a magnificent chestnut stallion, responded to the slightest touch, suggesting a deep bond between rider and animal. The coyotes followed at a distance, their eyes occasionally catching the last rays of sunlight. "What brings you out so late, Miss Vance?" Ryker asked over his shoulder, his voice carrying above the steady rhythm of hoofbeats. "I was helping Mrs. Holloway with her baking. The time got away from me," Julia replied, embarrassed by her carelessness. "Mrs. Holloway, the widow who lives at the edge of town?" "Yes. She's been teaching me some of her recipes. My mother—" Julia paused. "My mother passed last winter, and I've been taking care of the household since then." Ryker nodded solemnly. "I'm sorry for your loss, Miss Vance." They rode in silence for a few minutes, the only sounds the creaking of the saddle and the soft whipping of the evening breeze. The smell of sage and dust mingled with the leather of Ryker's vest, and the subtle scent of tobacco that clung to his clothes. "What about you, Mr. Vaughn?" Julia finally asked. "What brings you to Westcliff?" Ryker was quiet for a moment. "A fresh start, I suppose. I was a rancher down in Texas, but things changed. Thought I'd try my luck up here. The mountains appealed to me." Before Julia could inquire further, lights appeared in the distance, the lanterns of her family's homestead glowing like beacons in the gathering darkness. Relief washed over her, though mixed with an unexpected twinge of disappointment that their journey together was ending. As they approached the modest two-story house, the front door swung open. Henry Vance stood on the porch, rifle in hand, his weathered face tight with worry. Behind him, Julia's younger sisters, Mary and Alina, peered anxiously into the darkness. "Julia!" Her father called out, the tension in his voice evident. His eyes narrowed when he saw she wasn't alone. Ryker brought his horse to a stop a respectful distance from the house. "Evening, Mr. Vance," he called, touching the brim of his hat. "Vaughn," Henry acknowledged stiffly. "What's going on here?" Julia slid down from the horse before Ryker could help her. "Papa, Mr. Vaughn helped me. There were coyotes on the trail. They were stalking me. He scared them away and offered to escort me home." Henry's expression softened slightly, though suspicion still lingered in his eyes. "That's so," Ryker nodded. "Yes, sir. Pack of 3 looked mighty hungry. Wouldn't have been right to leave the young lady to face them alone." Henry studied the cowboy for a long moment before lowering his rifle. "Then you have my thanks, Vaughn." Julia moved to her father's side but turned to look up at Ryker. "Thank you again, Mr. Vaughn. I'm very grateful." Ryker smiled, and in that moment the hardness of his features seemed to soften. "My pleasure, Miss Vance. Perhaps I'll see you in town sometime." "Perhaps," she replied, feeling a blush creep into her cheeks. With a final tip of his hat, Ryker turned his horse and rode back toward town. Julia watched him go, his silhouette gradually fading into the darkness, the howls of the disappointed coyotes echoing in the distance. "Inside, Julia," her father said firmly, placing a protective hand on her shoulder. "It's getting cold." As Julia stepped into the warmth of her home, she couldn't help but glance back one last time at the now empty trail. There was something about Ryker Vaughn that intrigued her, a mystery in those blue eyes that she couldn't quite place. Little did she know that this chance encounter would be just the beginning of a story that would change both their lives forever. The next morning dawned clear and bright, with no trace of the previous evening's peril. Julia rose early, as was her custom, to prepare breakfast for her father and sisters before they began their day's work. The bread she had brought home, the very bread that had perhaps attracted the coyotes with its enticing aroma, now sat sliced on the table alongside fresh churned butter and preserves. "Tell us again about the cowboy, Julia," 12-year-old Alina asked excitedly, as she spread blackberry jam on her bread. Her eyes sparkled with the romance of it all, a handsome stranger rescuing her sister from wild beasts. "There's nothing more to tell," Julia replied, though she couldn't help the small smile that touched her lips. Mr. Vaughn happened to be riding by at the right moment, that's all. Ryker Vaughn isn't just passing through, Henry Vance commented, his tone neutral but his eyes watchful. He bought the old Peterson place about a month ago, been fixing it up some. Julia looked up from pouring coffee. The Peterson place, but that's been abandoned for years. Henry nodded. Got it for a good price from what I hear. Man's got ambition, I'll give him that. Do you know him well, Papa? Julia asked, trying to sound casual. Her father's eyes narrowed slightly. Not well. Met him at Stockton's general store when he first arrived. Seems capable enough, but I don't know much about his background. He paused, fixing Julia with a meaningful look. And neither do you, daughter. Julia felt heat rising in her cheeks. I was merely curious, Papa. He did help me, after all. And I'm grateful for that, Henry conceded. But these are wild times, Julia. Not everyone who acts the gentleman is one. Mary, who at 15 was already developing a romantic streak, sighed dreamily. Was he handsome, Julia? Mary, Henry scolded. Julia busied herself with clearing plates to hide her smile. I hardly noticed, she lied, remembering all too well the strong line of Ryker's jaw, the intensity of his blue eyes. Well, handsome or not, Henry said firmly. I don't want you girls wandering far from home alone anymore. Julia, you'll take one of the hands with you if you need to go to town again. Yes, Papa, Julia agreed, though the thought of being escorted everywhere like a child chafed at her independent spirit. After breakfast, Julia found herself drawn to the window more often than her chores demanded, her eyes drifting toward the eastern horizon where the Peterson place lay. It was foolish, she knew, this sudden interest in a man she had barely met. Yet she couldn't deny the flutter in her stomach when she recalled how effortlessly he had lifted her onto his horse, or the gentle concern in his voice when he'd asked if she was all right. As midday approached, Julia made a decision. Papa, she called, finding her father in the barn repairing a broken bridle. I need to return Mrs. Holloway's basket. Would it be all right if I rode over there? I'll be back well before dark, I promise. Henry looked up, suspicion immediately clouding his features. This sudden need to return a basket wouldn't have anything to do with a certain cowboy, would it? Of course not, Julia protested, perhaps too quickly. But Mrs. Holloway needs her basket, and I wanted to thank her again for the extra loaves she sent with me. Her father studied her for a long moment before sighing. Take Rusty and be back by 4. Not a minute later, you understand. Julia beamed and kissed her father's cheek. Thank you, Papa. I'll be careful. Within the hour, Julia had saddled Rusty, their gentle mare, and was trotting toward Westcliff with Mrs. Holloway's basket secured to the saddle. She had taken extra care with her appearance, choosing her blue gingham dress that brought out the color of her eyes and pinning her honey blonde hair in a neat bun beneath her bonnet. Westcliff was bustling with its usual midday activity when Julia arrived. She tethered Rusty outside the general store, planning to pick up a few items her father needed after visiting Mrs. Holloway. As she secured the reins, a familiar voice called her name, Miss Vance. Julia turned to find Ryker Vaughn approaching, looking even more striking in the full light of day than he had in the twilight. He wore a clean white shirt with his leather vest, and his dark hair was neatly combed beneath his hat. He carried a bundle of supplies under one arm. Mr. Vaughn, she acknowledged, willing her voice to remain steady. It seems I have the opportunity to thank you properly in the light of day. He smiled, and Julia noticed a small scar at the corner of his mouth that somehow only enhanced his rugged appearance. No thanks necessary. I'm just glad I happened along when I did. He glanced at her mare. You're not riding alone again, I hope. It's broad daylight, Julia pointed out, and I promised my father I'd be home well before dusk. Coyotes aren't the only danger in these parts, Ryker said, his expression growing serious. We've had reports of a gang of outlaws operating between here and Pueblo. The Jenkins farm was robbed just last week. Julia frowned. I hadn't heard that. Your father probably didn't want to worry you, but you should be careful. He hesitated, then added, if you'd like, I could accompany you back to your homestead when you're done in town. Julia felt a thrill at the offer but shook her head reluctantly. My father might misunderstand your intentions. Ryker's mouth quirked up at one corner. And what exactly are my intentions, Miss Vance? The directness of his question caught Julia off guard, and she felt her cheeks grow warm. I wouldn't presume to know, Mr. Vaughn. He laughed softly, a rich sound that made her heart skip. Fair enough. But the offer stands should you change your mind. I'll be at the Silver Dollar having lunch once I finish my errands. Julia nodded, unable to trust her voice for a moment. I should get on with my business as well. Good day, Mr. Vaughn. Good day, Miss Vance, he replied, touching his hat brim before continuing down the boardwalk. Julia watched him go, a strange mix of emotions swirling within her. There was something about Ryker Vaughn that both intrigued and unsettled her. He was undeniably charming, and his actions last night had been nothing but gentlemanly. Yet there was a guarded quality about him, as if he carried secrets he had no intention of sharing. She completed her visit with Mrs. Holloway, who was delighted to see her, and insisted on sending her home with a jar of honey and some fresh eggs. Such a sweet girl you are, the elderly woman had said, patting Julia's hand. Your mother would be so proud of how you're taking care of your family. The mention of her mother had brought the familiar ache to Julia's heart. Elizabeth Vance had been gone for almost a year now, taken by a winter fever that had swept through the county. There wasn't a day that passed that Julia didn't miss her gentle guidance and unwavering love after leaving Mrs. Holloway's. Julia found herself lingering in town longer than she had planned. She purchased the items her father needed at the general store, then, almost against her will, found herself walking past the Silver Dollar Saloon. Through the window, she could see Ryker sitting at a table, nursing a cup of coffee as he read a newspaper. As if sensing her presence, he looked up, catching her eye through the glass. A slow smile spread across his face, and he nodded in acknowledgement. Julia hurried away, embarrassed to be caught staring. She had just reached Rusty and was preparing to mount when a commotion down the street caught her attention. 3 rough-looking men had emerged from the bank, moving with suspicious haste toward their horses. As Julia watched, one of them pulled a bandana up over his face, and she glimpsed the glint of a gun at his waist. Bank robbers, she gasped, looking around frantically for the sheriff. But Sheriff Tate was nowhere to be seen, and the few townspeople on the street seemed oblivious to the danger. Without thinking, Julia rushed back to the Silver Dollar, bursting through the door. Mr. Vaughn, she called. The bank, I think it's being robbed. Ryker was on his feet instantly, his hand moving to the revolver at his hip. Stay here, he commanded, his voice sharp with authority as he strode toward the door. But Julia had never been one to follow orders blindly. She hurried after him, reaching the boardwalk just as shots rang out. The 3 men were now mounted, firing into the air as they spurred their horses down the main street. People scattered, diving for cover as the robbers thundered past. Ryker had drawn his weapon but held his fire as townspeople crossed his line of sight. Damn it, he muttered, watching the bandits disappear around a bend. He turned to Julia, his expression severe. I told you to stay inside. I couldn't just hide, she protested. Someone might have needed help. His face softened slightly. You've got spirit, Miss Vance. But these men aren't coyotes, they're killers. They wouldn't hesitate to gun down a woman if she got in their way. As he spoke, Sheriff Tate came running up, red-faced and puffing. "What in tarnation happened?" "Bank robbery," Ryker informed him tersely. "3 men headed east. They're armed and dangerous." The sheriff cursed. "That'll be the Carson gang. They've been hitting banks all across the territory." He looked at Ryker appraisingly. "You handy with that 6-shooter, Vaughn? I could use some deputies to ride with me after them." Ryker hesitated, his eyes flickering to Julia. "I'd be happy to help, Sheriff, but I promised Miss Vance an escort home. After yesterday's encounter with those coyotes, I'm concerned for her safety." Julia was touched by his consideration but shook her head. "Please don't let me keep you from helping, Mr. Vaughn. I can wait until you return." "That could be hours, maybe days," Ryker said. "The trail might be cold by morning." "Then you should go now," Julia insisted. "I'll be fine riding back alone. It's still early." Sheriff Tate cleared his throat. "Actually, Miss Vance, I'd feel better if you weren't traveling alone, what with those outlaws on the loose, if they circle back this way." "I have an idea," Ryker said suddenly. "Miss Vance, how would you feel about riding out to my place? It's on the way to your homestead, and I could see you safely the rest of the way home once we've dealt with these bandits." Julia blinked in surprise. "Your place, but—" "I understand it's not entirely proper," Ryker acknowledged, "but these are unusual circumstances. My housekeeper, Mrs. Flores, would be there for propriety's sake. You'd be safer than traveling alone and closer to help if those outlaws do circle back." Julia considered the suggestion. Her father would be furious if he knew she was even contemplating visiting a bachelor's home unchaperoned, housekeeper or no. But the alternative was potentially crossing paths with dangerous criminals on the lonely road home. "All right," she agreed finally, "but I'll need to send word to my father so he doesn't worry." "I'll dispatch one of my deputies to the Vance place right away," Sheriff Tate assured her. "He can explain the situation to your father." And so it was decided. Ryker quickly penned a note for Julia to give to Mrs. Flores, explaining the situation and asking the housekeeper to make Miss Vance comfortable until his return. Then, with a tip of his hat and a reassuring smile, he mounted his horse and rode off with Sheriff Tate and 4 other deputies to pursue the bank robbers. Julia watched them go, an inexplicable sense of worry settling in her chest. She had known Ryker Vaughn for barely a day, yet somehow the thought of him riding into danger troubled her deeply. Shaking off the feeling, she mounted Rusty and set off toward the Peterson place toward Ryker's home with both apprehension and curiosity mingling in her heart. The Peterson ranch lay nestled against the foothills, a modest but well-built structure of weathered wood and native stone. As Julia approached, she could see the improvements Ryker had already made to the once neglected property. The broken fences had been mended, the barn roof repaired, and a small vegetable garden sprouted near the house, evidence of careful tending. A plump, middle-aged woman with graying black hair emerged from the house as Julia dismounted, wiping her hands on her apron. "You must be Miss Vance," she said in accented English, her tone warm and motherly. "I am Sophia Flores. Mr. Vaughn's messenger arrived just before you. Please, come inside." Julia handed Rusty's reins to a young stable boy who had appeared from the barn, then followed Mrs. Flores into the house. Inside, she found a surprisingly comfortable home. The furnishings were simple but of good quality, and everything was meticulously clean. A fire burned cheerfully in the stone hearth, and the smell of fresh baking filled the air. "Mr. Vaughn said you might be staying until he returns from helping the sheriff," Mrs. Flores said, gesturing for Julia to sit at the kitchen table. "I have just made coffee and apple cake. You will have some, yes?" "That sounds lovely, thank you," Julia replied, removing her bonnet. As Mrs. Flores busied herself with cups and plates, Julia glanced around curiously. "Have you worked for Mr. Vaughn long?" "Since Texas," the housekeeper replied, setting a generous slice of cake before Julia. "My husband Miguel and we came north with him when he bought this place. Miguel tends the horses and helps with the ranch work, and I keep the house." She smiled fondly. "Mr. Vaughn, he is a good man to work for, fair and kind." Julia took a bite of the cake, which was delicious. "You knew him in Texas then? Was he a rancher there as well?" A shadow seemed to pass over Mrs. Flores's face. "Yes, he had a fine ranch, but there was trouble." She busied herself pouring coffee. "It is not my place to speak of Mr. Vaughn's past. He is a private man." Julia's curiosity only deepened. What kind of trouble had driven Ryker from his Texas ranch to this remote Colorado homestead? Before she could frame another question, Mrs. Flores changed the subject. "Mr. Vaughn tells me you were brave with the bank robbers today. You raised the alarm." Julia shook her head. "I only saw them leaving. I wish I could have done more." "It is good you did not try," Mrs. Flores said firmly. "Those men, they are dangerous. Mr. Vaughn knows how to handle such men." There was something in the way she said it that made Julia wonder again about Ryker's past. "Has he dealt with outlaws before?" Mrs. Flores merely smiled mysteriously. "As I said, Miss Vance, Mr. Vaughn has many stories that are his to tell, not mine." They passed the afternoon pleasantly enough, with Mrs. Flores showing Julia around the ranch. The main house was modest but well built, with 3 bedrooms upstairs and comfortable living areas below. The kitchen garden was Mrs. Flores's pride, filled with vegetables and herbs that reminded her of her native Mexico. Behind the barn, a small stream provided water for the livestock and irrigation for the crops Ryker had started to plant. "He works very hard," Mrs. Flores commented as they walked back toward the house. "From sunrise until dark most days, building something that will last," he says. As the afternoon waned with no sign of Ryker's return, Julia began to worry. Her father would be expecting her, despite the deputy's message. "Perhaps I should head home," she suggested. "It's still light enough to reach our homestead before dark." Mrs. Flores frowned. "Mr. Vaughn would not like that. He was most insistent that you stay until he could escort you. The outlaws, they might still be in the area." Julia was torn between her growing concern for her family's worry and her reluctance to disappoint Ryker by disregarding his wishes. Finally, a compromise was reached. Miguel would ride to the Vance homestead with a note from Julia, explaining the delay and assuring her father that she was safe and properly chaperoned. As dusk settled over the ranch, Julia found herself standing on the porch, gazing toward the road that led back to Westcliff. The first stars were appearing in the eastern sky, and a crescent moon hung low on the horizon. The peacefulness of the scene belied her inner turmoil. Why was she so concerned about a man she barely knew? Why did Ryker Vaughn's mystery intrigue her so? "He will come back safe," Mrs. Flores said softly, joining her on the porch. "He always does." Julia turned to the older woman. "You care for him a great deal," Mrs. Flores nodded. "Like a son." "My own boy was killed in the war. When Mr. Vaughn hired Miguel, he got me as well." Her eyes took on a faraway look. "He saved us in more ways than one." Before Julia could ask what she meant, the sound of hoofbeats drew their attention. A rider was approaching at a steady pace, his silhouette unmistakable even in the fading light. "Mr. Vaughn," Mrs. Flores called out, relief evident in her voice. Ryker dismounted wearily, leading his horse toward the barn. Even in the dim light, Julia could see that his clothes were dusty and there was a streak of what looked like dried blood on his sleeve. "You're hurt," she gasped, hurrying down the porch steps. Ryker looked up, surprised to see her rushing toward him. "It's nothing, Miss Vance, not my blood." His voice was tired but warm. "I'm glad to see you're still here. I was worried you might have tried to make it home alone." "Mrs. Flores convinced me to wait," Julia explained, studying his face with concern. Despite his reassurance, he looked exhausted, with dark shadows beneath his eyes and a tightness around his mouth that spoke of pain. "What happened with the bank robbers?" she asked as they walked toward the house together. Ryker sighed heavily. "We tracked them to a canyon about 10 miles east. There was a shootout. One of them was killed, another wounded and captured. The third, their leader, James Carson, escaped." He rubbed a hand across his face. "Sheriff Tate and 2 of the deputies are taking the prisoner to Pueblo. The rest of us came back to warn folks to stay alert. Carson's not the type to give up easily." Inside, Mrs. Flores insisted on serving a hot meal, which Ryker ate with the methodical determination of a man refueling rather than enjoying his food. Julia sat across from him, sipping a cup of tea and watching him surreptitiously. Now that her initial relief at his safe return had passed, she was acutely aware of the impropriety of her presence in his home as night fell. "Mr. Vaughn," she began carefully, "I appreciate your hospitality, but I really should return home. My father will be worried." Ryker looked up from his plate, his blue eyes tired but alert. "Miguel returned from your homestead just before I arrived. He says your father understands the situation but expects you home first thing tomorrow." He hesitated. "Miss Vance, Julia, I know this isn't proper, but I wouldn't suggest it if I didn't genuinely fear for your safety. Carson is dangerous, and he knows these hills. I'd never forgive myself if something happened to you because I let you ride home alone." The use of her first name sent an unexpected warmth through Julia. She found herself nodding in agreement. "Very well. If my father is informed and Mrs. Flores will be here." "Of course," Ryker assured her. "Mrs. Flores has prepared the guest room for you. I promise you'll be treated with the utmost respect under my roof. After dinner, Mrs. Flores showed Julia to a small but comfortable bedroom on the second floor. The housekeeper had laid out a clean nightgown slightly too large but serviceable and left a pitcher of fresh water and a basin for washing. "This was Mrs. Peterson's room," she explained. "Mr. Vaughn has not used it since buying the place. He sleeps at the other end of the hall." Once alone, Julia changed into the borrowed nightgown and sat on the edge of the bed, brushing out her long blonde hair with strokes that gradually slowed as her thoughts wandered. This strange turn of events, finding herself spending the night in Ryker Vaughn's home after knowing him for barely 2 days, seemed like something from one of the dime novels her sister, Mary, loved to read in secret. Yet there was nothing fictional about the danger posed by the outlaws, or about the genuine concern Ryker had shown for her safety. And there was certainly nothing fictional about the way her heart had raced when he'd said her name, or how relieved she'd felt upon seeing him return unharmed. Julia was just about to extinguish the lamp when a soft knock sounded at her door. "Yes," she called, hastily pulling a shawl Mrs. Flores had provided around her shoulders. "It's Ryker. May I speak with you for a moment?" Julia hesitated, aware of how improper it was to receive a man in her bedroom, even with the door between them. "One moment," she replied, quickly retrieving her dress and holding it in front of her nightgown before opening the door a few inches. Ryker stood in the hallway, still fully dressed but freshly washed. His dark hair was damp and he'd changed into a clean shirt. "I wanted to make sure you have everything you need," he said, his eyes carefully fixed on her face. "Yes, thank you, Mrs. Flores has been very kind," Julia replied, conscious of her unbound hair falling over her shoulders. Ryker nodded, a slight smile touching his lips. "Good. I also wanted to thank you for raising the alarm today. Your quick thinking saved lives. The bank teller was pistol whipped, but he'll recover." If the robbers had had more time, they might have killed him to eliminate witnesses. Julia shuddered at the thought. I'm glad I could help, though I didn't do much. You did more than most would have dared, Ryker countered. He hesitated, then added, I've arranged for Miguel to escort you home first thing tomorrow if that's acceptable. I'd take you myself, but Sheriff Tate has asked me to help organize a search party for Carson. Julia felt a pang of disappointment but nodded her understanding. Of course. The safety of the community must come first. Ryker studied her face for a long moment, and Julia had the distinct impression he wanted to say something more. Instead, he simply nodded. Sleep well, Julia. You're safe here. Thank you, Ryker, she replied, the use of his first name feeling both strange and right on her lips. After he'd gone, Julia closed the door and leaned against it, her heart pounding inexplicably fast. There was something in the way he'd looked at her, just then, something warm and intense, that made her feel both vulnerable and strangely powerful. She returned to bed and extinguished the lamp, but sleep was long in coming as her mind replayed every moment of their brief acquaintance, searching for clues to the enigma that was Ryker Vaughn. The morning dawned bright and clear, with sunlight streaming through the lace curtains of the guest room window. Julia woke feeling refreshed despite her restless night. She dressed quickly in yesterday's clothes, pinning her hair in a simple but neat style before making her way downstairs. She found Mrs. Flores in the kitchen, already busy preparing breakfast. The delicious aroma of fresh coffee and frying bacon filled the air. Good morning, Miss Vance. The housekeeper greeted her warmly. Did you sleep well? Yes, thank you, Julia replied, though it wasn't entirely true. Dreams of coyotes, bank robbers, and a certain blue-eyed cowboy had disturbed her rest. Can I help with anything? Mrs. Flores waved her to a seat. No, you are our guest. Mr. Vaughn would be most displeased if I put you to work. Speaking of Ryker, Julia glanced around the kitchen. Is Mr. Vaughn not joining us for breakfast? A shadow crossed the older woman's face. He left before dawn to meet with Sheriff Tate and the search party. He asked me to give you his apologies and to tell you that Miguel will take you home after breakfast. Julia nodded, trying to hide her disappointment. She had hoped to see Ryker once more before returning home to thank him properly for his hospitality. I see. Well, I certainly don't want to delay my return. My father must be worried. Mr. Vaughn left a note for you, Mrs. Flores added, placing a folded piece of paper beside Julia's plate. He asked me to give it to you at breakfast. Julia's pulse quickened as she picked up the note, unfolding it carefully. The handwriting was bold and clear, much like the man himself. Miss Vance, I regret that duty calls me away before I could see you safely home myself. Please know that your safety remains my utmost concern, which is why I have asked Miguel to escort you. These are dangerous times, and I would never forgive myself if harm came to you. I hope you will allow me to call on you properly once this business with Carson is concluded. There is much I would like to discuss with you, if you are willing. With sincere regards, Ryker Vaughn. Julia read the note twice, a warm glow spreading through her chest at his words. He wanted to call on her properly, as a suitor might. The very thought made her heart race in a most improper manner. Mrs. Flores, who had been watching her read with a knowing smile, placed a plate of food before her. Mr. Vaughn is a good man, Miss Vance, but he carries burdens from his past. He will need someone with a kind heart and strong spirit if he is to find peace. Julia looked up, startled by the housekeeper's candor. Mrs. Flores, I hardly know Mr. Vaughn, and he barely knows me. Sometimes, the older woman replied wisely, the heart recognizes what the mind has yet to understand. After breakfast, Julia helped Mrs. Flores clear the table despite the housekeeper's protests. As they worked, Julia's curiosity got the better of her. "Mrs. Flores, you mentioned yesterday that Mr. Vaughn saved you and your husband in more ways than one. What did you mean by that, Mrs.?" Flores was quiet for a long moment, her hands stilling in the dishwater. "It is not my story to tell in full," she finally said. "But I will say this. In Texas, there were men who did not like that Miguel and I owned land. They said Mexicans should not have such rights. These men, they burned our crops, poisoned our well." Her voice grew tight with remembered pain. "When our son tried to stop them, they killed him." Julia gasped softly. "That's terrible. I'm so sorry." Mrs. Flores nodded. "Mr. Vaughn, he was our neighbor. When he learned what happened, he rode out with his men and drove those bandidos away. He offered us work on his ranch, a place to live in safety." Her eyes grew distant. "He risked much to help us. Those men, they were powerful in that county. They had friends in high places." "Is that why he left Texas?" Julia asked gently. "Because he stood up for you," the housekeeper sighed. "That was part of it, the rest." She shook her head firmly. "That is for him to tell you if he chooses." Before Julia could press further, Miguel appeared at the kitchen door, hat in hand. "The wagon is ready, Miss Vance, whenever you wish to depart." Julia thanked Mrs. Flores for her hospitality and promised to visit again soon. The housekeeper embraced her warmly. "You are welcome here any time, Miss Vance, and I hope we will see more of you in the future." The journey back to the Vance homestead took less than an hour in Miguel's wagon. They traveled in comfortable silence, Miguel occasionally pointing out wildlife or commenting on the fine weather. Julia found herself scanning the horizon repeatedly, half hoping to glimpse Ryker and the search party, though she knew they would likely be miles away by now. As they approached her home, Julia saw her father waiting on the porch, his stance rigid with concern despite the deputy's assurances. The moment the wagon pulled into the yard, he strode forward, his relief evident in the loosening of his shoulders. "Julia," he called, helping her down from the wagon. "Thank God you're safe." "I'm fine, Papa," she assured him. Mr. Vaughn and Mrs. Flores were perfect hosts. Henry Vance nodded stiffly to Miguel. "Please convey my thanks to Mr. Vaughn for looking after my daughter. She, Senor Vance. Mr. Vaughn, he say to tell you he will come by tomorrow or the next day to speak with you if the search for the outlaw permits." Julia felt her father stiffen beside her. "Does he now?" Henry murmured, his tone unreadable. "Well, we shall see." After Miguel departed, Julia found herself subjected to a barrage of questions from her sisters, who found the entire situation terribly romantic. "Did he rescue you again?" Mary asked dreamily. "First from coyotes, then from bank robbers." "It wasn't like that at all," Julia protested, though she couldn't help smiling at their enthusiasm. "Mr. Vaughn is simply a gentleman who was concerned for my safety." "Is he going to court you?" Eleanor asked, her young face alight with excitement. "Eleanor Vance." Her father scolded. "That's quite enough of such talk. Julia barely knows the man." But Julia couldn't help wondering the same thing as she went about her chores that day. Was Ryker's note indicating his intention to court her? And if so, how did she feel about that prospect? She had known him for only 2 days, yet she couldn't deny the strange pull she felt toward him, a mixture of curiosity, admiration, and something deeper that she wasn't quite ready to name. That evening, as Julia helped her sisters with their lessons, a commotion outside drew them to the window. A rider was approaching at a gallop, his horse lathered with sweat from hard riding. It took Julia a moment to recognize Sheriff Tate beneath the dust that covered him. Henry met the sheriff at the door. "Tate, what brings you out here at this hour, Carson?" the sheriff panted, accepting the cup of water Julia quickly fetched. "The outlaw's been spotted heading this way. He's got 2 new men with him, likely members of his gang who weren't at the bank robbery. Julia felt a chill run through her. This way? You mean toward our farm? Sheriff Tate nodded grimly. We think he might be targeting isolated homesteads now that the towns are on alert. Vaughn suggested I warn you folks specifically, given your property is one of the more remote ones in this area. Ryker sent you? Julia asked, her heart racing at the mention of his name. He's leading one of the search parties, Tate confirmed. They're sweeping the eastern hills, trying to cut Carson off before he can do more harm. Henry's face hardened with resolve. I appreciate the warning, Sheriff. We'll be ready if that scoundrel comes anywhere near my family. After Sheriff Tate departed, Henry began preparing the homestead for a potential attack. He instructed Julia to keep her sisters in the house while he and their 2 ranch hands, Jeb and Charlie, checked the perimeter. Load the shotgun and keep it by the door, he told Julia. If you hear anything suspicious, don't hesitate to use it. The night passed tensely, with Henry taking turns with the ranch hands to keep watch. Julia hardly slept, listening for any unusual sounds and checking on her sleeping sisters periodically. By morning, when no attack had come, some of the tension eased, though Henry insisted the girls remain close to the house. It was mid-afternoon when Julia, gathering eggs from the henhouse, heard the approach of several horses. Her heart leapt to her throat as she peered cautiously around the henhouse door. Relief flooded her when she recognized Ryker riding at the head of a group of 5 men, including Sheriff Tate. "Papa," she called, hurrying toward the house. "Riders coming, it's Mr. Vaughn and the sheriff." Henry emerged from the barn, rifle in hand, his expression wary but less alarmed now that he knew who approached. He walked out to meet the riders, with Julia following a few steps behind. Ryker dismounted, looking even more exhausted than he had the previous evening. There was a fresh tear in his shirt sleeve, and a bandage was visible beneath the fabric. "Mr. Vance," he greeted, removing his hat. "Sheriff Tate told me he warned you about Carson. I wanted to check that you and your family were safe." "We're fine," Henry replied. "No sign of any outlaws." Ryker nodded, his gaze shifting to Julia. Despite his obvious fatigue, his eyes warmed at the sight of her. "Miss Vance, I trust Miguel saw you home safely yesterday." "Yes, thank you," Julia replied, trying to keep her voice steady under her father's watchful eye. "Are you hurt?" she added, nodding toward his bandaged arm. Ryker glanced down as if he'd forgotten about the injury. "Just a graze. Carson took a shot at us from cover early this morning. We've been tracking him since, but lost the trail about 5 miles northeast of here." Sheriff Tate dismounted as well, wiping sweat from his brow. "We believe Carson and his men might be holed up in one of the abandoned mining camps in the foothills. We're organizing a more thorough search at first light tomorrow." Henry frowned, considering this information. "You think there's still danger to my family?" "I think it's wise to remain vigilant," Ryker answered carefully. "Carson is unpredictable and desperate. But I've arranged for deputies to patrol the outlying homesteads for the next few days, including yours." Henry nodded stiffly. "I appreciate that, Vaughn." Julia, seeing how exhausted the men looked, spoke up. "You all must be hungry and thirsty after your search. Please, come inside. I can offer you coffee and food." Her father looked like he might object, but Sheriff Tate spoke first. "That's mighty kind of you, Miss Vance. My men could use a brief rest before we continue our rounds." Inside, Julia busied herself preparing coffee and setting out the bread and cold ham she'd prepared for supper. Mary and Alina were wide-eyed at the presence of so many armed men in their home, particularly Ryker, about whom they had heard so much. As Julia worked, she was acutely aware of Ryker watching her, though he maintained a respectful distance and directed most of his conversation to her father. They discussed the outlaws, the search efforts, and eventually the topic turned to ranching. "I've started with a small herd," Ryker was saying. "Just 30 head for now, but good stock. I'm hoping to expand next spring if all goes well." 30 head is a decent start, Henry acknowledged. "The Peterson place has good grazing land, though the water rights have been disputed in the past." Ryker nodded. "So I've learned. I've filed the proper paperwork with the county to clarify my claim. I intend to do things properly." Something in the way he emphasized the last word made Julia glance up. Ryker was looking directly at her father, his expression serious and intent. Henry seemed to consider him for a long moment before giving a slight nod of understanding. Before they left, Ryker managed a brief private word with Julia as she walked with him to the door. "I meant what I wrote in my note," he said quietly. "Once this business with Carson is concluded, I would like to call on you properly with your father's permission, of course." Julia felt her cheeks warm. "I would like that, Mr. Vaughn." "Ryker, please," he said, his blue eyes softening. "At least when we're speaking privately." "Ryker," she amended, liking the way his name felt on her lips. He smiled, reaching out to briefly touch her hand, a fleeting contact that nevertheless sent a jolt of warmth through her. "Be careful, Julia. Keep your doors locked at night until we've caught Carson." "I will," she promised. "And you be careful as well. That graze looks more serious than you're admitting." His smile widened. "Worried about me, Miss Vance?" Before Julia could respond, Sheriff Tate called from outside. "Vaughn, we need to move on if we're to check the Wilson place before dark." Ryker tipped his hat to Julia. "Until next time," he said, his voice carrying a promise that made her heart beat faster. As she watched the men ride away, Julia was struck by the realization that in just 3 days, Ryker Vaughn had somehow become important to her in a way she couldn't quite explain. It wasn't simply gratitude for his repeated assistance, nor was it merely attraction to his undeniable good looks. There was something about his quiet strength, his evident integrity, and yes, even the mysteries of his past that called to her. What she didn't know, couldn't know, was that the danger posed by James Carson was about to bring their fledgling relationship to a crucial turning point, one that would reveal secrets Ryker had hoped to keep buried and test the fragile bond forming between them. The next morning dawned gray and threatening, with heavy clouds hanging low over the mountains. Julia rose early, as was her custom, to help her father with the morning chores. The oppressive weather matched her mood, worried about the threat posed by Carson and his gang, and concerned for Ryker's safety as he participated in the search. As she gathered eggs in the henhouse, a sound caught her attention, the soft whinny of a horse, followed by muffled voices. Her father and the ranch hands were in the barn, and her sisters were still asleep in the house. Setting down her basket, Julia peered cautiously through a crack in the henhouse wall. 3 men on horseback were approaching the homestead from the west, using a stand of cottonwoods for cover. They were rough-looking, unshaven, with bandanas pulled up to conceal their faces. Julia's blood ran cold as she saw the rifles they carried and the determined way they surveyed the property. Moving as quietly as possible, she slipped out the back of the henhouse and darted toward the barn, keeping low and using the smokehouse and water trough for cover. Her heart hammered in her chest as she reached the barn door. "Papa," she hissed urgently, finding her father checking a horse's hoof. "Riders coming, 3 men with guns and faces covered. I think it's Carson's gang." Henry's face hardened. He set down the horse's hoof and reached for the rifle that never left his side these days. "Get inside the house with your sisters. Lock the doors and stay away from the windows." "Jeb, Charlie," he called to the ranch hands. "We've got company." Julia hesitated, reluctant to leave her father. "Papa, now, Julia," he commanded, his tone brooking no argument. "I need to know you girls are safe so I can focus on these vermin." Julia nodded and slipped out of the barn, making a dash for the house. She had just reached the back porch when a shout rang out. "There she is! Get her!" A shot cracked through the air, splintering the porch railing inches from her hand. Julia screamed and dove through the kitchen door as more shots followed. Inside, she slammed the door shut and threw the heavy iron bolt. "Mary, Eleanor," she called, rushing to the front of the house where rifle fire had erupted in earnest. Her sisters appeared at the top of the stairs, wide-eyed with terror. "What's happening?" Mary cried, clutching Eleanor's hand. "Outlaws," Julia explained tersely, grabbing the shotgun from its place by the door. "Stay upstairs and keep away from the windows. If anyone tries to come up those stairs who isn't Papa or me, use this." She handed Mary a small revolver that her father had insisted she learn to use after their mother's death. Mary took the gun with trembling hands. "Julia, I'm scared." "I know," Julia said, giving her sister a quick, fierce hug. "But Papa needs our help. Be brave for Eleanor and stay hidden." From outside came the sounds of gunfire and men shouting. Through the front window, Julia could see her father and the ranch hands exchanging shots with the outlaws, who had taken cover behind the water trough and a wagon. The battle seemed evenly matched for the moment, but Julia knew that could change in an instant. A movement at the side of the house caught her eye. One of the outlaws, a tall man with a red bandana, was attempting to circle around to the back. If he reached the kitchen door, he might be able to break in while her father was occupied at the front. Without hesitation, Julia positioned herself by the kitchen window, shotgun ready. As the man approached, she steeled her nerve and shouted, "Stop right there or I'll shoot." The outlaw froze, then laughed. "Well, well, what have we here? A little lady with a big gun. I bet you don't even know how to use that thing." "My father taught me well," Julia replied, her voice steadier than she felt. "Take one more step and you'll find out just how well." The man's eyes narrowed. He seemed to consider her threat for a moment, then suddenly lunged for the door. Julia pulled the trigger. The shotgun kicked hard against her shoulder, and the outlaw cried out as the shot peppered his side. He staggered but didn't fall, turning toward her with rage in his eyes. "You'll pay for that, girl," he snarled, drawing his pistol. Before he could fire, another shot rang out from somewhere behind him. The outlaw jerked, then crumpled to the ground. Julia stared in shock as Ryker appeared from the corner of the house, his smoking gun still raised. "Julia," he called, rushing to the kitchen door. "Are you all right?" Julia fumbled with the bolt and threw the door open. "Ryker, thank God. My father and the ranch hands are at the front fighting the other outlaws. Sheriff Tate and his deputies are almost here," Ryker assured her. "I rode ahead when we heard the shooting." He glanced down at the man he'd shot. "That's not Carson, but he's one of the gang for sure." More shots echoed from the front of the house, followed by a cry of pain that Julia recognized with horror as her father's voice. "Papa," she gasped, turning toward the sound. Ryker caught her arm. "Stay here, I'll help your father." "No," Julia insisted, reloading the shotgun with shells from the box on the shelf. "That's my father out there. I'm coming with you." Ryker looked like he wanted to argue but nodded tersely. "Stay behind me, and if I tell you to take cover, you do it without question. Understood?" "Understood," Julia agreed, her hands steady despite her fear. They moved carefully through the house to the front door. Through the window, Julia could see her father on the ground by the porch steps, clutching his leg. Jeb was providing covering fire from behind a rain barrel, while Charlie was nowhere to be seen. "Your father's hit but alive," Ryker assessed. "One outlaw down by the trough. The other, likely Carson, is behind that wagon." He's pinned down for now, but if he realizes how few of you are left standing, he might make a break for it or charge the house." "What's the plan?" Julia asked, trying to think clearly through her fear for her father. Ryker considered for a moment. "I'll circle around through the side yard and come up behind the wagon. When I start firing, you open the door and lay down covering fire so Jeb can pull your father to safety. Don't expose yourself any more than necessary." Julia nodded her agreement, though the thought of Ryker placing himself in such danger made her heart clench. "Be careful," she whispered. "Always am," he replied with a quick smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Then he was gone, slipping out the side door. Julia positioned herself by the front door, shotgun ready. She counted slowly to 60, giving Ryker time to get into position, then held her breath, waiting for his signal. The sudden barrage of gunfire from the direction of the wagon told her Ryker had made his move. Without hesitation, Julia threw open the door and fired the shotgun toward the wagon, being careful not to hit anywhere Ryker might be. Jeb immediately understood the plan and dashed to Henry's side, dragging the wounded man toward the porch while Julia provided cover. "Get him inside," she called to Jeb as they reached the steps. Together they pulled Henry into the house while gunfire continued to echo outside. "Carson," Henry gasped through gritted teeth. "It's him, Julia. He said he came for you, said Vaughn would pay for interfering." Julia's blood ran cold. "For me? But why?" Before her father could answer, a shout from outside drew her attention. "Vaughn, I know you're out there." The voice was harsh with a southern drawl. "Show yourself, you yellow-bellied lawman." "Lawman," Julia repeated, confused. She moved to the window, peering carefully through the curtain. What she saw made her gasp. Ryker stood in the open now, his gun trained on a man who must be James Carson. The outlaw was wounded but still dangerous, his pistol aimed squarely at Ryker. "You thought you could hide up here in Colorado, didn't you, Vaughn?" Carson sneered. "Thought no one would recognize the famous Texas Ranger who killed my brother." "Your brother was a murderer and a thief, Carson," Ryker replied evenly. "He chose his path, just like you did." Texas Ranger. Julia's mind reeled with this revelation. Ryker had never mentioned being a lawman. Why had he kept his past a secret? "Drop your gun, Carson," Ryker continued. "Sheriff Tate and his deputies will be here any minute. It's over." Carson laughed bitterly. "Maybe so, but I'll have the satisfaction of knowing I sent you to hell first." He leveled his pistol more firmly. What happened next seemed to unfold in slow motion. Julia saw Carson's finger tighten on the trigger. Without thinking, she raised the shotgun and fired through the open window. The blast caught Carson in the shoulder, spinning him around. His shot went wild, and before he could recover, Ryker closed the distance between them and disarmed him with a swift, practiced move. By the time Sheriff Tate and his deputies galloped into the yard, Ryker had Carson face down in the dirt, hands bound behind his back with his own belt. The danger was over, but Julia's mind was swimming with questions as she watched Ryker hand the notorious outlaw over to the sheriff. When Ryker finally entered the house, his eyes immediately sought Julia. She stood by her father's side, where Jeb was bandaging Henry's leg wound. The bullet had passed clean through the muscle, painful but not life-threatening. "Mr. Vance," Ryker said, approaching cautiously. "How bad is it?" "I'll live," Henry grimaced. "Thanks to you and my daughter." Ryker's gaze shifted to Julia, a mixture of admiration and concern in his blue eyes. "You were very brave. Not many experienced men would have kept their heads the way you did." Julia met his gaze steadily. "Thank you, but it seems there's a lot about you I don't know. Ranger Vaughn." A shadow passed over Ryker's face. "I was hoping to explain that to you under different circumstances." "You were a Texas Ranger?" Henry asked, wincing as Jeb tightened the bandage. Why keep that a secret? Ryker sighed, removing his hat and running a hand through his hair. I left the Rangers 2 years ago after bringing down a powerful rancher who was behind a series of land grabs and murders in West Texas. His name was William Carson, James's older brother. Mrs. Flores mentioned trouble in Texas, Julia said quietly. She said you helped her and Miguel when men tried to drive them off their land. Ryker nodded. The Flores were just two of William Carson's victims. He wanted their land for water rights, and when they wouldn't sell, his men started making trouble. Their son was killed trying to protect their property. So you went after this William Carson, Henry prompted. I was assigned the case, Ryker confirmed. It took months, but I finally gathered enough evidence to arrest him. There was a shootout. William and 2 of his men were killed, and I was wounded. He unconsciously touched his side where Julia guessed an old injury lay. After that, James Carson swore revenge. He threatened everyone connected to me, my family, my colleagues, even witnesses from the trial. So you left Texas, Julia concluded, pieces falling into place. To protect the people you cared about. Ryker's eyes met hers. The Rangers offered me protection, but it would have meant putting others at risk. I decided it was better to disappear, start fresh somewhere new where Carson wouldn't think to look. I resigned my badge and headed north. But he found you anyway, Henry said grimly. Eventually, Ryker acknowledged. When I saw him in Westcliff during the bank robbery, I knew it was only a matter of time before he recognized me. That's why I was so insistent about Julia's safety. Julia studied Ryker's face, seeing now the weight of responsibility and worry he'd been carrying. Why didn't you tell me? Tell us. At first, I was just being cautious. The fewer people who knew my past, the safer everyone would be, Ryker explained. Then, after we met, he hesitated, his eyes softening as they held hers. I didn't want you to look at me differently. I've seen how people change when they learn you've worn a badge. They either expect you to solve all their problems, or they treat you like you're just waiting to catch them doing something wrong. And which did you think I would do? Julia asked, unable to keep a hint of hurt from her voice. Before Ryker could answer, Sheriff Tate entered the house. Carson and his man are secured. We'll take them to Pueblo for trial as soon as we've checked on the other wounded. He nodded to Henry. Deputies bringing the doctor from town for you, Vance. Much obliged, Sheriff, Henry replied. Tate turned to Ryker. I need to wire the Texas authorities, let them know we've got James Carson. Anything particular you want me to tell your old captain? Ryker considered for a moment. Tell him the debt is paid. He'll understand. After the sheriff departed, silence fell over the room. Julia was aware of her father watching her and Ryker carefully, assessing the undercurrents flowing between them. Julia, Henry finally said, why don't you check on your sisters? They must be terrified up there. Julia recognized her father's request for what it was a chance to speak privately with Ryker. She nodded and headed upstairs, where she found Mary and Alina huddled together in Mary's room. They flung themselves into her arms, sobbing with relief at the news that the danger was past and their father would recover. By the time she had calmed them and returned downstairs, the doctor had arrived and was tending to Henry's wound. Ryker stood by the window, his posture tense as he stared out at the now quiet yard where deputies were removing the dead outlaws. Mr. Vaughn, Julia called softly, joining him at the window. What did my father say to you? Ryker turned to face her, his expression unreadable. He suggested that perhaps it would be best if I kept my distance for a while, until Carson's trial is over and any remaining members of his gang are apprehended. Julia felt as if a cold hand had gripped her heart. And what did you say? I said he was probably right, Ryker replied, his voice low and regretful. Your family has already been put in danger because of my past. I couldn't bear it if something worse happened to any of you because of me." "That's not your decision to make," Julia said firmly, surprising herself with her boldness. "Or my father's, for that matter." Ryker's eyebrows rose. "Julia, no," she interrupted. "You came into our lives and saved me from coyotes. You helped me when outlaws robbed the bank. You protected me and my family today. And now you think the right thing to do is just disappear from our lives, from my life. It's not what I want," Ryker admitted, his voice rough with emotion. "But it might be what's necessary." Julia shook her head stubbornly. "James Carson found you because you were helping with the search. You were doing the right thing, Ryker, being honorable, living the way a good man should live." She took a step closer to him, her eyes never leaving his. "If you ride away now, you're letting Carson win. You're letting fear dictate your actions." Ryker stared at her, surprise and something like hope dawning in his eyes. Most women would be running in the opposite direction after learning a man had brought danger to their doorstep. "I'm not most women," Julia replied simply. A slow smile spread across Ryker's face. "No, you certainly are not, Julia Vance." He glanced toward where Henry lay on the sofa, the doctor finishing his bandaging. "Your father might not be easily convinced." "Leave my father to me," Julia said with more confidence than she felt. "But you have to promise me something." "What's that?" "No more secrets," she said firmly. "If there's to be anything between us, I need to know I can trust you to be honest with me, even when the truth is difficult." Ryker nodded solemnly. "I promise." He hesitated, then reached out to take her hand, his touch gentle but sure. "I've never met anyone quite like you, Julia. From the moment I saw you facing down those coyotes with nothing but a basket of bread and your courage, I knew you were special." Julia felt her heart quicken at his words and the warm pressure of his hand around hers. "I'm just a farm girl with a talent for baking." "You're far more than that," Ryker countered. "You're brave and kind and stubborn in all the right ways." His thumb traced a small circle on the back of her hand, sending a shiver up her arm. "If your father permits it, I'd still like to court you properly. No more chance encounters and emergency rescues." Julia smiled. "I'd like that too." The weeks that followed were filled with healing and rebuilding for the Vance family, for Ryker, and for the tentative relationship blossoming between them. Henry, despite his initial reservations, couldn't deny the debt they owed Ryker, nor could he ignore the way his daughter's face lit up whenever the former ranger came calling. And call he did properly, as promised. 3 days after the shootout, once Henry was resting comfortably and the homestead had been set to rights, Ryker arrived at their door, hat in hand, freshly shaved and wearing his best shirt. He brought a small bouquet of wildflowers for Julia and a bottle of good whiskey for her father. "Mr. Vance," he said formally, "I'd like your permission to call on your daughter." Henry, propped up on the sofa with his injured leg elevated, had studied Ryker for a long moment before responding. "You realize that my daughter is precious to me, Vaughn. Her safety and happiness are my primary concerns." "As they are mine, sir," Ryker had replied steadily. "I can't promise that my past won't ever cause difficulties again, but I can promise to be honest about those risks and to do everything in my power to protect Julia and your family." Henry had nodded slowly. "Julia seems determined to give you a chance despite my concerns. She's got her mother's stubbornness." A fleeting smile crossed his face. "I suppose I can do no less. You may call on her with proper chaperoning, of course." And so began a courtship, both traditional and unique. Ryker visited the Vance homestead twice a week, sometimes helping Henry with ranch work that the older man couldn't manage with his healing leg. Other times simply sitting on the porch with Julia, while Mary or Alina sat nearby, pretending not to listen to their conversations. They talked about everything: Ryker's childhood on a small farm in East Texas, Julia's dreams of opening a bakery someday, his years as a ranger, her struggle to fill her mother's shoes after her death. With each conversation, each shared story, the connection between them deepened. James Carson's trial was held in Denver a month after his capture. Ryker testified, as did Julia and her father. The outlaw was sentenced to hang for his crimes, but even facing death, his hatred burned bright. "You're a dead man walking, Vaughn," he had spat as deputies led him away. "My friends won't forget this." Despite the threat, life gradually returned to normal. Carson was executed 3 weeks later, and reports from Texas indicated that what remained of his gang had scattered to the winds, leaderless and hunted by both Texas Rangers and Colorado lawmen. By late autumn, as golden aspen leaves carpeted the hills around Westcliff and the first dusting of snow crowned the distant peaks, Ryker's visits had become the highlight of Julia's week. The townspeople had grown accustomed to seeing them together at church or walking arm in arm down the main street after Sunday services. It was during one such walk, as they strolled along the creek that meandered behind Westcliff's small schoolhouse, that Ryker finally voiced what had been growing in his heart. "Julia," he said, stopping beneath a golden-leaved cottonwood, "these past months have been the happiest of my life." Julia smiled up at him, her heart quickening at the intensity in his blue eyes. "Mine too." Ryker took both her hands in his thumbs gently stroking her fingers. "When I came to Colorado, I was running from my past, trying to start over somewhere no one knew me. I never expected to find someone who would make me want to build a future instead of just escaping the past." Julia felt tears pricking at her eyes. "Ryker, I love you, Julia Vance," he said simply. "I think I started falling in love with you the moment I saw you standing up to those coyotes, refusing to run even when you were afraid." "I love you too," Julia whispered, the words feeling both momentous and perfectly natural on her lips. "I think I knew it the night you came back from chasing Carson, exhausted and hurt, but still putting everyone else's safety before your own." Ryker smiled, then reached into his pocket and withdrew a small velvet pouch. "I've spoken to your father," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "He's given his blessing, if you'll have me." Julia's breath caught as Ryker opened the pouch and tipped a ring into his palm. It was a simple gold band with a small, perfect diamond that caught the autumn sunlight. "Julia Vance," Ryker said, kneeling before her despite the damp ground, "would you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" "Yes," Julia answered without hesitation, tears of joy spilling down her cheeks. "Yes, I will marry you, Ryker Vaughn." As he slipped the ring onto her finger, then rose to gather her in his arms for their first proper kiss, sweet and tender and full of promise, Julia thought back to that fateful evening when coyotes had stalked her on the trail home. How strange that fear and danger had led her to the greatest happiness she had ever known. Their wedding took place the following spring, when wildflowers dotted the meadows and the harsh Colorado winter had given way to the vibrant renewal of life. The small church in Westcliff overflowed with well-wishers, townspeople who had come to respect the former Texas Ranger and his brave bride, neighbors who had watched their courtship unfold, and even a contingent of Ryker's former Ranger colleagues who had traveled from Texas for the occasion. Julia wore her mother's wedding dress, carefully altered by Mrs. Holloway and Mary, with fresh wildflowers in her hair instead of a veil. Ryker cut a handsome figure in a new black suit, his face solemn but his eyes shining with love and pride as Henry walked Julia down the aisle to meet him. "Who gives this woman to this man?" the minister asked. "Her sisters and I do," Henry replied, his voice thick with emotion. He placed Julia's hand in Ryker's, then leaned forward to whisper, "Take care of my girl, Vaughn." "With my life," Ryker promised. Their vows were simple and heartfelt, spoken clearly for all to hear, yet somehow feeling like private promises between just the two of them. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Ryker cupped Julia's face gently in his hands and kissed her with such tenderness that several women in the congregation dabbed at their eyes. The celebration afterward was held at the Vaughn Ranch, no longer the Peterson place, but a thriving homestead that reflected Ryker's hard work and vision. Tables were set up in the yard beneath cottonwood trees strung with lanterns, and Mrs. Flores had outdone herself preparing a feast that combined Texas and Colorado traditions. As evening fell and fiddle music filled the air, Julia found a moment alone with her new husband, slipping away to the porch while their guests danced and celebrated. "Happy, Mrs. Vaughn?" Ryker asked, drawing her close. "Completely," Julia replied, leaning into his embrace. "Though it still feels strange to hear my new name." "You'll get used to it," he murmured, pressing a kiss to her temple. "We have the rest of our lives for you to practice." Julia turned in his arms to face him. "I never thought, when you rescued me from those coyotes, that I'd end up here married to the most honorable, brave, and loving man I've ever known." Ryker smiled, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. "And I never imagined that a chance encounter with a woman carrying bread would lead me to everything I never knew I wanted." "Those coyotes did us a favor in a way," Julia laughed softly. "Remind me to leave them some scraps now and then as thanks," Ryker teased, then grew serious. "I promise you, Julia, that I will spend every day trying to be worthy of your trust and your love." "You already are," she assured him, rising on tiptoe to kiss him. "Just be yourself, the man who cracks his whip to scare off danger and walks a woman safely home." The years that followed were filled with both joy and challenges, as all lives are. Julia and Ryker built their ranch into one of the most prosperous in the county, combining his knowledge of cattle with her determination and business sense. They welcomed their first child, a son they named Thomas Henry, just over a year after their wedding. A daughter, Elizabeth Rose, followed 2 years later, and another son, Michael James, 2 years after that. Henry Vance eventually sold his homestead to move closer to the Vaughn Ranch, building a smaller house where he could be near his grandchildren while still maintaining his independence. Mary married the son of a neighboring rancher, while Alina eventually pursued her dream of becoming a schoolteacher. The threats from Carson's former associates never materialized, though Ryker remained vigilant, never taking his family's safety for granted. His past as a Texas Ranger occasionally proved useful when troubles arose in the county, and while he never sought to wear a badge again, he was always ready to stand for what was right. As for Julia, she did eventually open her bakery, a small shop in Westcliff that quickly became known for having the best bread and pastries in 3 counties. She operated it 3 days a week, balancing her passion for baking with her duties as a mother, wife, and ranch partner. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Ryker surprised Julia by taking her back to the spot on the trail where they had first met. The spring afternoon was warm, with wildflowers dotting the hillsides and birds singing in the cottonwoods. They rode side by side, comfortable in the companionable silence that comes from years of shared love. "Remember this place?" Ryker asked as they reached a familiar bend in the trail. Julia smiled, looking around at the landscape. "How could I forget?" "I was terrified, clutching my breadbasket and trying not to run from those coyotes." "You were the bravest woman I'd ever seen," Ryker said, dismounting and helping her down from her horse. "Still are." They spread a blanket beneath a tree, and Ryker unpacked a picnic basket complete with fresh bread that Julia had baked that morning. As they ate and talked, reminiscing about the decade they had shared, the sound of distant howling drifted on the breeze. "Your friends are saying hello," Ryker teased, nodding toward the ridge where, remarkably, several coyotes could be seen silhouetted against the sky. Julia laughed. "I prefer to think of them as matchmakers." Ryker reached across the blanket to take her hand, his eyes filled with the same warmth and love they had held on their wedding day. Best matchmakers a man could ask for. As the coyotes disappeared over the ridge, their howls fading into the vast Colorado wilderness, Julia moved closer to her husband, resting her head on his shoulder. "I used to wonder why things happen the way they do, why I stayed too late at Mrs. Holloway's that day, why those coyotes appeared, why you happened to be riding by at exactly the right moment." "And what conclusion did you reach?" Ryker asked, his arm tightening around her. Julia smiled, lifting her face to his for a kiss that still held all the sweetness and passion of their first. "That sometimes the most frightening moments lead us to our greatest blessings, that love often finds us when we least expect it. And that a woman with bread, a cowboy with a whip, and a pack of hungry coyotes can be the beginning of the most beautiful story," Ryker finished, his lips finding hers once more as the golden Colorado sun dipped toward the mountains, bathing them in light that seemed to promise many more years of happiness to come. In the decades that followed, the story of Ryker and Julia Vaughn became something of a legend in Westcliff, how a chance encounter with danger had brought together two souls destined for each other, how love had overcome adversity, and how a former Texas Ranger and a baker's daughter had built a legacy of honor, courage, and devotion that would inspire generations to come. And on quiet evenings, when coyotes could be heard howling in the distant hills, the townspeople would sometimes smile and say that those wild creatures were still out there, perhaps bringing other lonely hearts together in their own mysterious way. For Julia and Ryker, those howls would always be a reminder of their beginning of bread and whips and walking home, and of a love that had started with fear but blossomed into a lifetime of joy.